Okay, let's see. You got an email from me today that I put up the 10th and last worksheet on Canvas, right? That's for next Monday. And then a week from Monday is your progress report, right? And the whole point of the progress, there is no sort of minimum number you need to have looked at. It better be more than one at this point, right? But the whole point of the progress report is A, you don't wait till the last minute to do your research, right? And B, I can help you sort of say, hey, Madison, these are all well and good, but be sure you pick up that book, right? It gives me the opportunity to intervene gently and let you know that there's something out there waiting for you if I know about it, okay? So that's a week from Monday. Then that's what, the 19th, is that right? So it's right before Thanksgiving. I should probably, well, my mom is coming that week. My 85-year-old mother is coming. The widow Trowbridge, ever since Dad died. Anyway, so I'll try to get it to you as soon as I can, but I have to be entertaining at the same time. But I hope to get those back to you before Thanksgiving weekend's over, even probably before it begins. And since it's a small class, it shouldn't take that long. Okay, for the class I had to miss, I'm sorry about Monday, I've got a history of lower back spasms, and it didn't floor me, but if I didn't get on top of it, it was gonna, right? So I had to take a muscle relaxer to get ahead of it, and I was just like loopier than all, right? You come in and go, ah. So I had to stay home, and so you have the lecture recorded on Rembrandt and Vermeer and the end of Dutch Baroque, which we had started in class, right? It's about 40 minutes long. So be sure you play that, right? Because that's kind of important stuff as we move ahead toward the final. And it leaves us with only a little bit of 17th century art to cover before we move ahead into if all things go well tonight, we'll be getting to the 19th century already, because I hate the 18th century, so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. So we're going to look at France, right? We've been sort of bouncing around the different countries, more so than we have in other periods, because in the 17th century, in the Baroque period, Spain is very different from the Low Countries. It's very different from Flanders. It's very different from Italy. It's very different from France. So it's really worthwhile sort of parsing into what makes each of these countries works of art in the 17th century take on its individualized character, right? And that sort of fragmentation that we're seeing is something that will continue from this point forward. It's a lot easier to sort of come up with sort of lump answers to what makes Renaissance art, but that gets harder and harder as we move. More modern artists become more independent from this idea of a broad movement that characterizes an entire century. So we're starting to get there, although we've seen a lot of things repeat throughout Baroque art as we've looked at it, right? There's always been this idea of action and energy, right? Everywhere we've looked. There's been an ideal of the works of art that try to pull you into them in one way or another, either through drama, right, or through an appeal to your senses, or through the artist including things that seem as if they want, that they reach out to you, right? These things have been common sort of everywhere we've looked, whether they're Catholic or Protestant, right? Have been sort of ongoing themes that we see. So let's look at France and Simon Vouet, a French artist from the 17th century. It's important to realize that just as when we talked about Holland and Flanders, the Spanish Netherlands, we talked about the 80 Years' War, right? And how this was an era that was marked by war. The 80 Years' War lasted from 1568 to 1648. There was a big peace conference in 1648. And it was joined after 1618 with a second war that was waged between the Holy Roman Empire, which had allied with the Habsburgs, our kings of Spain, right? And of course, this is going to bring in the Papal States. And there were other peoples that were very much anti-Habsburg, right? And France was part of, then obviously Holland was part of this as well. But France was very much anti-Habsburg, right? They were allied with others against the Habsburg Empire, against the Habsburg idea of sort of gaining dominance over most of Europe. And as you can see from the map, France is bordered by the Habsburgs on two sides. Not only do we have Spain down south at the Pyrenees, right? But we have the Spanish Netherlands to the north as well. So sort of two of its borders are borders shared with Spain, and they're allied against them. And we talked before about how diplomacy is often done through intermarriage, right? How strange sometimes those relationships become. When we looked at the Queen of England, right, Henrietta Maria, we talked about the fact that her Medici lineage, right, through the King of France, sister to the King of Spain, is all trying to rectify this fact that almost all of Europe is at war with each other during the early part of the 17th century, right? And France is no different. And this, for France, becomes an important issue because a lot of French artists end up traveling to Rome, specifically to get away from the war that's being fought at home as part of the 30 Years' War. And so, in fact, a great number of our artists either travel just to travel, or they travel and stay in Rome. In fact, the two of the most important artists of the 17th century end up in Rome for the entirety of their careers. Right? And it's because there's the war in France is making it difficult to stay home. So Simone Vouet is amongst these. Now, not only are they fleeing the war, but it actually becomes sort of a requirement for artists, maybe an expectation is a better way of putting that. An expectation for artists to go to Italy. There was a deep interest on the part of people in the French art world, a very, very deep interest in Italian art. And this goes all the way back to the Mannerist period when the King of France, Francis I, hired Italian artists to come and decorate his palace. Right? Remember, he also hired Leonardo da Vinci to just come and hang out. Right? That's where Leonardo died, was in France. So there is a long-standing connection between court patrons, the royalty, and Italian artists. They love Italian art. So it was kind of expected that artists would travel to Italy to see the best works ever. Right? That's the whole idea. Go see the best things ever. And they not only would look at Michelangelo, right, his biggest draw probably for them, but they would also look back at ancient Roman sculptures, right, and ancient Greek things that they might see, architecture as well. They'd make what's come to be known as the Grand Tour, right? And this became sort of expected of artists to do this. So Simone Vouet goes to Rome in the 1620s. And part of it is, again, getting away from the ongoing 30 Years' War, right, which at that point is only 4 years deep, right? But also to scope out what's going on in Italy because the French think that stuff's the best. Right? And who's he most obviously been looking at when he gets to Italy? This was painted in Italy. Who do you go there to look at? Who does that remind you of? The Vouet on the right. Dark background, spotlighting, brown colors with... Sorry? Caravaggio, indeed. He's been, he might have gone to seek out Michelangelo and look for, great Roman art, Renaissance art, but he becomes swept up with contemporary Italian Baroque art. He sees Caravaggio, and like everybody, it seems, who sees Caravaggio, he goes, wow, I've never seen anything like this. I'm going to make my versions of it, right? So here's St. Matthew writing his gospel, and he's being inspired by the angel who's sort of, I like how he's going over his fingers. You got to be sure you include the bit about Jesus being born in a manger. He's just kind of going through the points here on his hand. And Matthew's looking up toward him as he's sort of actively kneeling and again spills out into our space. This is in the same chapel as the Calling of St. Matthew, right? They're still there, side by side, right? One's on the side wall, one's on the back wall of this chapel that Caravaggio was commissioned to decorate. And you can see that Vouet is it's a rearrangement of the basic motifs here, right? And it's just Caravaggio inspired, right, left, and center, right? He uses the lighting to simplify the composition. He uses, to darken the background and then to highlight the figures and make them that much more dramatic, right? It has that sense of sort of gritty realism that was a hallmark of Caravaggio's work is also there with Simon Vouet, right? If anything, it's more dramatic because he brings it even closer to us, right? I mean, Caravaggio engages our space because his robe looks like it's three-dimensional, doesn't it? Like it's coming out into your world. But Vouet, he brings, we'll talk about like it's a movie. He brings the camera in even closer, for the dramatic close-up. So that we see the figure in half figure rather than full figure, right? Our proximity to him is that much more enhanced, right? All of this learned from looking at Caravaggio works. Now, when Vouet arrived in Italy, Caravaggio was already dead, right? So he never met the artist. All he did was to look at the churches as part of the Grand Tour and see the Caravaggios that were hanging in Rome. You can still go to Rome. I think when I was in Rome a couple years ago, I saw 4, maybe 5 Caravaggios still in the churches that they were commissioned for. And in Vouet's time, more than that yet, right? And he's simply picking it up from looking at these works that are really different from what he's seen. And he may have also seen works by people like Artemisia Gentileschi, right? The Caravaggio followers that we looked at, right? The Caravaggisti that we looked at. Orazio Gentileschi. Others, Ribera, whose works are emulating Caravaggio. He could have been looking at them just as easily as looking at Caravaggio. I think he's looking at Caravaggio, right? Now, both of these images are about men who had a hand in writing the Bible of sorts. St. Matthew, obviously a follower of Jesus, right, wrote one of the 4 Gospels, okay? St. Jerome is a scholar from 3 centuries later, sort of 300s AD, and he was responsible for coming up with the official Catholic Latin version of the Bible, right? So the Bible, Old Testament, New, written in 3 or 4 different languages, right? Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew. What St. Jerome did is he took all the different texts together, the different translations that existed, and was going to come up with the official version, the official translation of the Bible, right? And that's what we see him doing here, is he's busy translating the Bible, right? And just like St. Matthew, his task is guided by heaven, right? So the angel appears to him, and he's struck with revelation, right? Again, it's this dramatic moment of the miraculous appearance of the angel, explaining to St. Jerome that, that word there, you should translate this way, right? So he's not really writing like Matthew is. He's translating, but he's still getting heavenly guidance. And again, if we look at the table, it's got that sort of Caravaggio realism of things. We see his quill pens, right? He's got 2 of them there, and a little inkwell, and he's got the margins of the page all out, and he's taking a second before he writes, because you'll notice the page is empty of letters at this point, because he's going to listen to the angel. The angel's going to tell him how to translate it, right? So that is certainly the theme that Vouet is going to work on. You'll notice also on the table next to it, 2 things. We'll come to that in a second. Those are his glasses underneath the rag there next to the inkwell. And they're the kind that you pinch on your nose, right? They don't have temples. You just sort of clip them on the end of your nose. And they're reading glasses, right? And what's interesting is that they're the exact kind of glasses he would need to do what he's doing. But he's not wearing them. Right? And the reason is that he's listening to the angel. Glasses become a metaphor for seeing the world, right? I don't need my glasses to dream. I don't need my glasses to have a vision. I need my glasses to drive, right? I need my glasses to legally, it says on my driver's license, right? I need to have my glasses to drive because I can't see crap in the world. But if I'm not seeing the world, if I'm seeing heaven, I don't need those glasses anymore because that should be perfect sight. It's not a physical thing, right? And that's the point here, is that at this point, St. Jerome is not looking at the world around him. He's looking to heaven, right? Spiritual vision has superseded physical vision, right? And it's a subtle little device, but we see it all the time in art. When visionaries are having a vision, they'll do this, take off their glasses, because they don't need them anymore to see the thing that's appearing to them. Now you'll also notice on the table, in addition to the inkwell, the book, scholar, right? His glasses, what's that on the left by his elbow? Can you tell that big ball-like thing? Jason? It's a skull. That's exactly right. And it's looking right at him, right? So we see it from the back. And when he's writing, he'll look down and see the skull. Now, skulls, we look back at the images of St. Jerome, and we got quite a few of them going back over a couple centuries. He often has a skull with him. And usually it's included so that he remembers that time is short. It's a reminder of death, right? And the term we use for this in art and elsewhere is, in Latin, a memento mori. Memento, okay, we use that word still, right? Mori is the Latin word for death, right? A reminder of death. And St. Jerome needs a reminder of death because he needs to remember that he's got to stay on task, that death could come at any point. So not only should he make sure that his soul is pure in the right place, but over and above that, he's got a task that he's got to do, and he wants to get it done. Right? He doesn't want to have it interrupted by early death. So that's a theme we see here, is the idea of the mortality of St. Jerome. And you could add the glasses into that, couldn't you? Right? We need them as we get older. The differential between the physical body and the spiritual side, right, is a part of the theme. Now, if we think about the fact that the skull is a reminder of death and the reminder of mortality, look closely at the picture. Is there anything else there that might remind Jerome of his mortality? Is there anything else that Vouet has included here that might be a reminder of the shortness of life, brevity of life, or even of death itself? Can you see anything else there? I know it's kind of dark. Yeah? Lower right or upper right? Lower right. Hourglass. Right? Can you see that down there? Right? There's one thing there. So an hourglass, it's like having a watch right on the counter, right? As time is passing. And I have a detail coming up, so let's see how much sand is left, right, in the hourglass. So a reminder of time passing. Okay? Anything else? What about the candle? There's a snuffed candle, right? An unlit candle in the upper right corner as well. Now, in the lecture that I recorded to make up for Monday, we saw this in a still life picture, where there was a snuffed candle as a reminder that life is brief, that your light can go out at any time, right? So here it kind of pulls in a sort of double or triple symbolism. It goes with the skull as a reminder of time passing, brevity of life. It also sets up the fact that the light in the room is supernatural rather than physical, because there's a source of natural light and it's out. So that means the light that St. Jerome is bathed in is coming from heaven like the angel is. Right? And the third metaphor for this, right? Shortness of life, physical versus spiritual light. The third one is he's working deep into the night. Right? He's burning the candle down. So this is a task that takes a long time. And he's diligent. Right? Working even past lights out, if you will. So sort of multiple metaphors picked up with that, but certainly ties into an overall theme that we see elsewhere. And as Madison mentioned, in the lower right corner, there is an hourglass. There's plenty of sand left, right, in the hourglass. We're only about halfway through, if you will. So these are all reminders that time, in fact, passes. And there are tasks that we need to see to in order to assure, right, our own salvation. Okay. Another artist from France who's also terribly influenced by Caravaggio, right, has that same darkened quality, spotlit darkened quality as Georges de la Tour. And he never went to Italy, ever, right? Unlike Vouet, who saw Caravaggio's. We think that Georges Delatour may have never even seen a Caravaggio. It's hard to say. There's one in the Louvre. You might know this from the Da Vinci Code. It fell on the priest at the beginning of the Da Vinci Code and killed him, the Caravaggio in the Louvre. But when it got there, I don't know for sure. What we think is that Georges Delatour understood Caravaggio, got the idea from people like Vouet, who went and came back. In the same way that Velázquez and Zurbarán in Spain understood Caravaggio via Ribera, who's sending works of art back, right? So when we talk about these Caravaggisti, these followers of Caravaggio, right? Some of them, like Artemisia Gentileschi and Orazio Gentileschi, might well have met him and knew the works firsthand. Ribera knows the works firsthand. But then there's a bunch of second-hand Caravaggisti, like Georges Delatour, who never saw Caravaggio in their life, only saw works of art inspired by Caravaggio. Rembrandt probably falls into this category. We can't prove he ever saw one, right? We know one sold in Amsterdam, but we can't prove it. And he's got Caravaggio lighting too. So Caravaggio's influence is incredibly strong, and it's spread not only through his own works, but through works of artists that are inspired by him because it was so innovative, so radical, that people responded to it. Now, what sets Delatour's pictures apart, and this is something he does a lot, is he actually puts the light source in the picture. Of all of the Caravaggio followers we've seen so far, or Caravaggio himself, we almost never saw the source of light. Right? Look at Vouet. The source of light is out. So it comes from the upper left corner, from somewhere outside the frame. And that was true for every Caravaggio-like picture that we'd seen so far. But Delatour switches that up. Maybe that's because he never saw Caravaggio, right? And he puts the source of light there, and it's directly behind that skull, right? The flame licking up, but we don't see the rest of the candle. Now, if we think about these two pictures side by side, not only do we have a candle, reminder of life, right? Burning this time, but burning down, not snuffed, so it's not dead. But we also have a skull. And so again, we have these memento moris in the picture. And in this case, unlike St. Jerome, the message is different. She's thinking about death, pondering it, thinking about her salvation. This is the moment, well, you know who we talked about Mary Magdalene, right? She was a prostitute before she was a follower of Christ, right? This is the moment when she's still a prostitute. And she's taking a second to think about her life choices and what they mean. What are the ramifications of this? And this is the moment when she's about to convert in her heart, where she is repenting of her sinful life and is deciding to become a follower of Christ, right? So it's that Baroque moment, right? We've talked about this with lots of pictures, this Baroque moment of high drama and transition, right? Moments of transition. Jerome having a revelation, right? The Magdalene having a change of heart, right? And thinking about her life. And it's a wonderful, poignant picture because as she does, she rests her hand gently on the skull, which is stacked up on top of books, right? And she's sort of, okay, death is coming. Like the scene in Hamlet, right? Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well, right? All standing by the graveside and pondering his future. And she's looking directly at a mirror, right? And so she's sort of, again, thinking about herself, right? Maybe as she looks at the mirror and sees the skull in the mirror, she could think, oh, that could be me, right? I'm a skull, right? We all are, nothing but bones. And when we see them, they're a reminder of that's what's going to happen, you know? We may have cognition now, but one day we're just going to be dust, right? And so she's looking, right? And she's taking that moment to really reflect, to think about what her life means. And Delatour invites us into this, this interior moment of reflection. Not unlike what we saw Vermeer doing, if you played that thing back from Monday, but with more religion, right? not a secular scene, but in fact a religious scene. One of the things that I think is great about this picture, and it fits the period quite well, is the fact that the mirror doesn't quite reflect properly. Kind of like Velázquez's mirror when we looked at Las Meninas. Doesn't seem to quite reflect properly. So the way that mirror, in other words, the mirror is set up so that you and I can see what's reflected in it. Because if she looks at it, I don't know what she's going to see. Do you know what I mean? Because it's not really set up for her to look at her face. But it's set up so that when we look at the mirror, we see the other side of the skull. Right? Yet she is shown looking at the mirror. So I think what the artist wants us to do is for us to look at the mirror as well. For us to mimic her actions. To take a moment to ponder our fate. To ponder our mortality. Right? A memento mori, mortality, right? And look at this picture and think, well, none of my sins can be all that bad because Mary Magdalene converted. So you know that candy bar I stole from the store is nothing by comparison. Time for us to reflect and repent as well. And what we find during the Counter-Reformation, right, the last part of the 16th century and into the 17th century in Catholic countries, one of the things that we find is that penitent saints, right, saints in the act of repenting, are an incredibly popular theme during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. And the reason for this is for the Catholic Reformation, these were great role models. They were teaching tools, right? They could say to each of us, we should also, like Mary Magdalene, reflect on our fate. Understand that death could come at any time. Get our ship in order, right? And this is why Delatour flips that mirror a bit so that when we look at the picture, we see the skull from two different points of view, right? And mirror, we reflect. We think about what it means, right? So with Delatour and Vouet, we've seen two artists influenced by Caravaggio. One who travels to Italy, Vouet. One who doesn't, Delatour, right? But both deeply influenced by this sort of high drama, limited color scheme, right? Darkened backgrounds of Caravaggio. And there are other French artists also very much influenced by Caravaggio, many of whom travel to Italy to escape the war. There are other French artists, however, who show no influence of Caravaggio whatsoever. He isn't everywhere, right? And so when we look at Nicolas Poussin, we find a very different kind of Baroque art, if we think about Baroque as just being a synonym for the 17th century. A very different kind of Baroque art. A lot less dramatic. No Caravaggio. A brightly lit landscape. Right? Figures strongly horizontal. Most of the motifs without any great sort of plunges back into space. Figures arranged almost like fence posts, straight up and down in the foreground. And then counterbalanced by very, very strong horizontals at the sides. It doesn't have the sense of action and drama that we've come to see with Baroque art. And in fact, is a very, very different kind of style, even though we still call it Baroque, right? And this style is referred to as classicism because it's closest in style to other periods that are referred to as classical, such as the High Renaissance, where nothing seemed to move, right? Where things seemed sort of set, with triangles and geometries, right? Or ancient Roman and Greek art, where again we had balance and timelessness. And Poussin's image does not seem to move. Everybody seems very perfectly balanced, and that's because there aren't a whole lot of diagonals there, right? Just the edges of the mountain in the background, but none of them have the sort of vibrant diagonals like we saw in Rubens or Van Dyck, where things plunge back into space, right? Now, let's see. Why is my next picture? Oh, I know what it is. Okay. Why did artists move to classicism in the 17th century? A lot of it is that we think they're reacting against mannerism. Remember that mannerism had all of this confusion, these flailing bodies twisting and turning in space, ending up like, bowl of mashed potatoes, bodies that had odd musculatures. We think that this was the prominent style in France in the 16th century. So we think that both the Caravagisti and Nicolas Poussin and his classicism are reacting against that, making a cleaner, easier to understand kind of art. We also know that in the 17th century, the King of France, Louis XIV, was actually sponsoring classicism. In 1648, his minister, at that point Louis XIV is still pretty young, the minister of Louis XIV established the French Royal Academy, which existed all the way to the end of the 19th century. The Académie Royale des Beaux-Arts, right? The Fine Arts Royal Academy. And this was established in 1648. And the whole reason that the Royal Academy was established was to teach artists how to paint for Louis XIV, because he's got some plans, or his ministers do at first, and then Louis later. Palace decorations, gifts for diplomats. And Louis wants the works of art that represent him to, on one hand, be the same style, right? Be unified in message. But two, he wants them to be clear and legible. So he establishes the Royal Academy to train artists to paint things for him or to come from him as gifts. And he trains them, or the people there train them, in classicism. This becomes the official style of the French court. And from there, it kind of trickles down. Right? The rest of society ends up in France enjoying works of art that remind them of works that the king owns. Right? So Nicolas Poussin is not a Caravagisti by any means. He's practicing classicism, and that's the second great trend of art in France in the 17th century. Right? It sets French Baroque apart from almost all of the other countries. Now, what does classicism mean? It means that Poussin worked the composition out with great detail. I'm sorry, this is a little pixelated. Finding relevant Poussin drawings relevant to this picture, difficult. But what he would do as a working practice, and this was true of classicist artists, is that he would work it out in great detail. He'd do figure studies of each of the figures that were going to be in the picture. Then he would do compositional studies where he would lay it out and try to figure out how he'd arrive at the exact same composition. So this is actually the same story, which we'll talk about in a second. But one of the steps that he made on arriving finally at the finished composition, right? It's really worked out in extraordinary detail, right? And in addition to prep drawings like this, one of the things that set Poussin apart, was unique to Poussin, was he added another step to figure out his compositions. After he made the drawings and he got to the point where he figured out where the figures were going to be and how he wanted it laid out, to where it sort of looked like the composition on the right. And this is a step in that direction, right? What Poussin would then do was he would take that drawing and he would make little clay figures of each of the figures, and he'd make a little stage for them, and he'd put the little clay figures down, right? He'd start off making them nude, and then he would drape them, right, with either cloth or more clay, right? And he would put them on the little stage, and then he would bring out candles with reflectors behind them and play with the lighting, right, to figure out how it looked lit best. Do I want two lights? Do I want one? Do I want it over here, one over here? And he would set that up, and then he would make another drawing based on the model that he'd made, right? And that would then be the basis for the final work. And so that set him apart from a lot of other artists by adding another step of study, right? And that only indicates the degree to which Poussin is so meticulous in working out every possible detail, right? Including how the lighting would work, which is difficult in just a simple drawing like this, right? This is just to figure out where the figures are going to go and what they're going to be posed like, right? So all of that meticulousness, all of that study means it's not particularly spontaneous, right? Caravaggio is incredibly spontaneous. Had that sort of, a lot of the artists that we've looked at have been really spontaneous, right? When we looked at Frans Hals, remember the brushwork in Frans Hals or in Velázquez had a sort of spontaneity to them? Rembrandt has a sort of spontaneous feel, right? You've done the last worksheet, but the Night Watch has a certain spontaneity. It's like, let's walk out, right? Rather than being sort of stayed and posed. It has a sense of being caught in a particular moment. Poussin has no spontaneity whatsoever. And that's a hallmark of classicism. There's something about it that's really rigid. And that's even true to the way he handles the paint, right? Back to the idea of polishing your lights and darks. None of these sort of flashy brushwork that we saw in Rubens, right, or Van Dyck. But everything sort of polished and meticulous. And that even holds true for the perspective. And I don't know if you can tell or not, but he has a really strong, rigid perspective scheme, so that whether it's the architecture in the foreground, those three things in the foreground, or the details on the left border, or the buildings on the hill in the background, everything recedes to the exact same vanishing point. And this has fairly recently been shown up, but that's an X-ray of he put a pin in the canvas. There's a hole in the canvas. And this is true on a lot of Poussins. And he used strings, right, from the pins. They have a pin, he trace a string over here so he could get the vanishing point just right. And conservators have gone back and they've looked at where the vanishing point is, gone in with a close-up camera or microscope, and lo and behold, there it is, right? So all of this meticulousness sort of drains the vibrancy from the picture, right? It seems really posed and really sort of unmoving, right? Now, what's the story here? We've talked about this picture only from the point of view of how it was made and the style of the picture, right? The story is, of course, the story of Achilles. He's on the left in the blue with the helmet on, right? The great Greek hero of the Trojan War, right? And you know about it. You know about Achilles. Achilles' heel, right? His mother dipped him in a magic lake, holding him by his heel so that he would be impervious in battle except for the heel, but didn't get dipped, right? And this would make him one of the greatest heroes for the Greeks. And when the Trojan War comes around, of course, he can't be killed unless he gets hit in the heel, right? So invaluable to the Greeks. And after having, dunked him in the lake, Achilles' mother had heard that he was going to die in the Trojan War, because of the heel, right? And so she decides to protect him from the fate that she's been warned about, right? He's going to die in the war. So what she does is she dresses him up as a woman and sends him off to live in disguise on an island that's only populated by women, the island of Skyros, right? So he's hiding out there more or less in drag, right? And for years. Now, the Trojan War is building, and Ulysses, who's one of the other great heroes of the Greek army, finds out that Achilles is hiding out, and he's going to go get him. And he devises a plot so that he can figure out which of the women is Achilles, right? Because he's so well disguised. I can't imagine that it wouldn't be hard to tell, right? Look at the Adam's apple, right? But no, he's got a plot, which makes for a better story, right? And so what he does, Ulysses does, and this is the moment, I think this is kind of a charming picture. I don't much care for this kind of classical art. But what Ulysses does is he sends a big box of gifts to the island, and the box is filled with jewels, right? And mirrors and just things that would appeal to women. This sexist story, right? And in it, there's also a shield and a sword and a helmet. Again, shiny things, right? Along with the jewels and everything else. And of course, Achilles goes, ooh, shield and sword. And he puts on the helmet and he picks up the sword and he gets the shield over here and he gives himself up, right? He reveals who he is. And so what we see him doing is he's put on the helmet. What does it look like to be a soldier, right? And it is kind of charming. And I don't think it's meant to be funny, but I find it humorous, right? So this is, again, it's not Baroque in that it's not particularly dramatic, but it's a moment of revelation, isn't it? It's a moment of dramatic change, right? It's that high-pitched moment from the play, if there were a play, where Achilles reveals himself to Ulysses and is going to get drafted to the Trojan War and is going to die, right? This is where he moves from safety to death. Yeah. So, again, classical as well, in that it's interested in ancient Greek history, in addition to the style of the piece, right? All very sort of staid comparison with a lot of the things we've seen in the Baroque. Now, Poussin painted this in Rome. He had gone to Rome to avoid the war, spent most of the rest of his career there. The same thing happened with Claude Lorrain. His real last name is Jalais, but he came from the region of Lorraine, which was right on the front of the 30 Years' War battle. He also moves to Rome to foist his career and stays there for the rest of the time. And his name is Claude from Lorraine, right? The Lorraine district is over halfway between France and Germany, Alsace-Lorraine, right? And whereas Poussin paints figures in a landscape, Lorraine paints landscapes that just happen to have figures in them. That for Claude Lorrain, the major focus is the landscape. And most of his pictures look very similar to this one. They have a sort of soft evening light, right? We tend not to see the sun. Not always, but we tend not to see the sun. It comes in low on the horizon. It dapples through the trees and pools up in the foreground, right, in little spots of sunlight. It's the end of the day, right? Driving home at the end of your shift, right? Sun hasn't quite gone down yet. And we can see if we look at these two works from the National Gallery, the degree to which the basic structure of the landscape is really similar, right? Again, low evening light, sort of soft and warm, right? Yellow on the horizon. The sun coming in low and at an angle, even though it comes in from different sides. The main scene framed by these trees on either side, right? That sort of give you parentheses around the landscape. These are his tricks, and these are made-up landscapes, right? He's not painting them on site. He may have done watercolor sketches on site, but these are composed in the studio. And it's totally composed. It's made up, right? So he's just deploying elements based on observation in a way that he wants to frame the scene. And sometimes they're just genre scenes, like the one on the right with the merchants, and sometimes they're historical scenes. Scenes from classical history, like the one on the left. Now, the Judgment of Paris. Does anyone know the story of the Judgment of Paris? Not anything? Yeah, Jason?
The guy who gets his wife
From a goddess.
Hades,
Yeah, very good. He gets his wife from now. That's absolutely right, but it's only scratches the surface of things, right? So he's a shepherd, right? And he is he's in the city of Troy, okay? And he must choose. He's sort of asked by the gods to choose between three different goddesses. And he's supposed to say which one he likes the best, right? And each one has an attribute. And the whole sort of moral of the story is which attribute is best, and how do you choose between these three attributes. And so he's presented with three different goddesses. That's Paris on the left, right, on that rock. And he's in the midst of judging between these three goddesses, choosing which one he thinks is the best, right? And Minerva is the goddess of war, and she offers him victory in war, right? That's going to be her gift. And you'll notice that, I mean, they're all supposed to be beautiful, so she's stripping. But you'll notice at her feet there's a spear and a helmet as well. So this tells us that she's Minerva, the goddess of war, and she's going to offer him invincibility, right? He cannot be defeated in war. That sounds like a good offer, right? You'll win everything you ever try to do. Juno offers to make him the ruler of the world. And she's shown with a peacock. I'm not 100% sure about this. I think the peacock has to do with the ruler of the heavens in ancient Greek mythology, right? So she offers him power, right? Might and power. And the third goddess is Venus. And Venus offers him love. Not her own love, but she says, if you choose me, I will give you the most beautiful woman in the world to be your wife, as Jason said, right? So he can choose. Do I want a beautiful wife? Do I want ultimate power over everything? Do I want invincibility in battle? What is he going to choose? You'd think. He chooses love. He chooses the chick, right? He chooses the most beautiful woman in the world. And she's going to let him choose, right? Who do you think is the most beautiful woman in the world? And he says, oh, that's Helen of Troy. And when he chooses Helen to be his wife, she's got no choice. Gods are behind it. And this is what sets off the Trojan War. So if you ever heard the phrase, the face that launched 1,000 ships, that's Helen of Troy. Her beauty was so great that Paris chose her, and her beloved was so upset, her betrothed was so upset, that started the Trojan War. So, Jason, you had the outlines of it, but the key thing here, right, this is a momentous story for Greek mythology. This is the beginning of the Trojan War. And it's all because he chose beauty, right, over power or military strength, right? And I guess there's probably some moral here about the frivolousness of choosing beauty, but who knows, right? If that's really what he's intending. He's showing us again this very poignant moment, right? This is an important moment in the story. This sets the war to start. So again, as Baroque, even though it's not a particularly dramatic looking scene, it is hinging on this sort of dramatic moment. Yeah.
Is that the reason why, Paris is called the city of love?
That's a good question, and probably so. Although I think anymore, Paris is called the city of love because if you've ever been there, it's you need to go. I think we've built Paris, not this one, the city, in our mind to be the city of this sort of the Moulin Rouge and the Impressionists, and down through the ages that we think of it very much romantically, right? And all those people putting those locks on that bridge, right? Which they had to cut off because the bridge was going to fall down. There's so many locks on it, right? Yeah. So I do think that it's obviously named after him, and that may well be. Because it's also known as the City of Light, and so that's a totally different issue. Right? Okay, moving into the 18th century, so we're almost, more than 50 years later. What we find in the 18th century is that French artists, and we're going to be looking at France for a long time now, right? We're going to come to America a few times, but we're going to be spending a lot of the next 2 or 3 weeks on France. In the 18th century, in the 1700s, artists begin to react against classicism in the same way that classicism had reacted against mannerism. Right? There seems to be a pendulum swing away from it. And what we see when we get to the 18th century is works of art become much more frivolous, much less serious, much less staid than they were in the 17th century. They become more loose, right? Jason?
Is it still like Baroque art?
No. We have a new term for it, which we'll get to in a second. Yeah, it's what we call Rococo. That's coming up on the screen in just a second, right? Yeah, and this shift away from classicism really does seem to coincide with a shift in power. Classicism was associated with Louis XIV, who lives forever. He doesn't die until 1715, and this new style seems to begin around the time of his son, Louis XV, taking the throne in 1715. Okay, so you got me a bit ahead. It's coming up on the slide in just a second, right? So the story here, Cythera, painted by Antoine Watteau, is meant to be a Greek island. It again comes from Greek mythology, so these actually share something that way. But there's nothing in the picture that suggests that it's Greece. The air has gotten thicker. The landscape has gotten more lush. I always think these things look like a chia pet or something sort of like it's blooming as you look at it. The people are not dressed like Greeks. They're dressed like French aristocrats. And as we look at the picture, what we see is that here on the island of Cythera, everybody hooks up. It's like Party Island. It's like, what is it, like a reality TV show. You stick them all on the island and see who hooks up with who, right? And everybody is hooking up. And you'll notice that as the picture's been laid out, people are coupling, right? They're joining into couples. There's not having sex yet, but that's sort of the next logical step. And the more you look at the composition, the more you see that everybody's arranged into these groups of two, right? And we have the little putti around that are helping them fall in love everywhere we look. And that's because according to Greek mythology, and again, it doesn't look like a Greek island, but according to Greek mythology, Cythera is an island that is ruled by Venus, the goddess of love. And Venus is there, but only in statue form. The armless statue of Venus with flowers hung around her. At the bottom, a quiver full of arrows. This quiver full of arrows belongs to her son, who is Cupid. He sits on another quiver under his bum. His work is done, right? Everybody's in love, right? He's finished his job here today. So that's the general theme. His helpers, right, other Cupid-like figures, are here to help the rest of them fall into love. And then we have allegorical figures who are there to steer the ship back to civilization, right? So they've all come here, they've all fallen in love, and they're all aristocrats, with the exception, of course, of the mythological figures. Right? Now, Jason had asked, still call this Baroque? No. 18th century French art, we refer to as the term Rococo. It's Baroque on steroids, you know? It's just kind of exploded in a way. As I just mentioned as well, it seems to coincide with the reign of Louis XV, or at least the beginning of his reign in 1715, and seems in many ways to be a reaction against the official style of Louis's dad. That classicism of French Baroque was the official style of Louis XIV. Under Louis XV, the style shifts toward this more flamboyant Rococo style. Now, the fact that everybody on the island is aristocrats is important because this was commissioned by aristocrats. to decorate their houses. And this is where the politics of Louis XV comes into play, at least the political situation. Louis XIV kept his palace outside of Paris. You may have heard of it, the Palace of Versailles. That's where the peace talks were held in World War I. It was at the Palace of Versailles, right? And it's about 30 miles outside of Paris. It's far enough out that it's still outside of Paris today. And that's where he set up a brand new court, buildings, right, in this sort of classical French style, right? And all of the aristocrats that gravitate to the court moved with him out to Versailles, right? And that's where all of the aristocrats in the 7th century lived, was in the countryside, around Louis XIV, right, at the Palace of Versailles. Louis XV decided to move his royal residence back to Paris. And the aristocrats followed him. And that meant, after 70 years at Versailles, these followers, these aristocrats, the circle around the king, were now decorating new palaces that they're establishing on the periphery of Paris, sort of country palaces in the city. But they've relocated from Versailles back to Paris. And as they begin to decorate their palaces, they begin to decorate them with scenes of the countryside, of frolicking in the garden. This seems to be exactly what they want. And this is what inspires the Rococo, is this sort of wholesale redecoration of new palaces around Paris, with scenes of the idle rich, right? The aristocrats being aristocrats, having nothing but free time. In this case, love. And love in the garden seems to be a theme that they simply adore. This is what they want as decorations for their houses. Now, this style that we're seeing is very much indebted to Rubens. The sort of overblown style of Rubens came from one of your worksheets, right? Marie de Medici being shown her way to France. Rubens has this sort of operatic, over-the-top sort of style. And we saw it in a number of different works, but this one in particular, from your worksheets, right? It's part of a series of 20-some pictures done for the Queen of France. And they decorated her palace in Paris, which was in the middle of a garden, right in the center of Paris. What a great example to use when you're going to decorate your new palace, right? Borrow the style that's different from classical French Baroque, much more dramatic, much more overblown, right? Borrow that and make your palace look like the old palace of the Queen of France. Right? This is what seems to inspire this new Rococo style. Right? All the way back into the 17th century, artists in France, in the Royal Academy, kind of split into two rival camps. And there was a group that really believed in classical art, and they called themselves the Poussinnists. And there was a group that really believed in this more exuberant Baroque art, and they called themselves the Rubenists, because Rubens' art was available to them, right? And they were sort of rival factions through the course of the 17th century. But in the 17th century, there were more Poussinists than there were Rubenists. And by the time we got to the 18th century, there were more Rubenists. And that became the dominant trend. So the rise of Rubens as the primary influence on French art is one of the things that leads now to this new Rococo style. Right? But what we'll see, we'll look at 4 different images, is that the theme of love in the garden seems to be the preferred theme of the patrons of these works, and the perfect sort of image to decorate their country palaces. I should say suburban palaces, right? They're just on the outskirts of Paris. And they tend to be incredibly over the top, right? Again, really exuberant, really kind of Rubensy in a lot of different ways. and focusing on love, right? Focusing on a rather sort of frivolous kind of love. So Boucher is one of the most prominent of the Baroque artists. Another aristocratic decoration for a palace near Paris. Love in the garden as the overall theme. It's Venus now, right? This is where she bathes herself in the woods. You can see she's dipped her feet, or Cupid has, in the little river down there that's utterly clear. Cupid still has his arrows, so we can identify him, and that helps us to identify Venus, but she looks every bit like a 18th century woman with her clothes off. Pearls in her hair, more putti behind her, more of Cupid's helpers there. And the question is, of course, who is Cupid going to make fall in love? And the answer is probably us, right? Just like the doves at the feet of Venus are already impassioned, right? Look at with both of these, that amazing sort of humid haze. The air is just sort of thick and ripe with potential, ripe with growth. I don't like them either, right? Except I do because they're so silly, you know?
Oh, I was just
Ye-
laughing just because I wouldn't use the term growth. That's like what you think of the hair. I was like, no, never mind.
I don't know. When you think about, when I think about sort of, if you think about, okay, let's think about with that kind of humidity, it's humid. Can you buy that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Think about what DC looks like in July, August, when the humidity starts to get really bad, and then all of a sudden the kudzu just starts to grow everywhere, you know, and all the vines you see, and everything sort of becomes extraordinarily lush, and just that humidity adds to sort of a jungle kind of growth. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe it's chubby is a sign of growth. Like I know that's
No, she's really healthy.
yeah, they're healthy. Like
Yeah. Everything's over the top, right? Everything's kind of well fed, if you will. And you think about the trees with this lush growth. Look at all the stuff that's coming up the trunk of that tree, right? It's the sense that it's got enough coming in that more can come out, if you will. And Venus is but it's also a Rubens woman, isn't it? Right? If you go back, right? Look at Rubens's women, right? You can still find, it's not something that you hear every day, but there's a term Rubensian for hefty women. You can read enough, you'll find it out there, right? And the idea is that you're kind of built like that, which is not, they're not unhealthy, they're just big, right? And they're not like glorious ladies of wrestling big, right? They're chubby, but sort of the Germans call it saftig, just kind of spilling out like think about the St. Pauli girl or something if she were heavier, right? Just kind of spilling out of your clothing. And Boucher is exactly the same way, right? Everything's sort of spilling out. Even the vegetation, I think, is sort of, and even the robes, right? Look at this beautiful robe she's got around her that you can almost ignore, or at first not even see because you're looking at everything else. But look, they're also all wedding cake colors. They're like, seafoam green and dusty rose, and all of these sort of springtime, I kind of find them vile colors, right? But that wonderful sort of satin blue that's underneath her, and you can tell that it's all about textures and beauty, and that one shot of red to bring your eye in, but it's very delicate, right? And very frivolous. It's about love. I mean, has Cupid accidentally shot Venus, maybe? Do they go back to that Mannerist idea that there's love in the air, right? Well, we know who this was made for. It was actually made as a pair of paintings that were meant to be seen side by side. So Venus at the bath in the woods and Venus at her toilet inside, which was a theme we saw Titian do. And these are exactly the same size. The one on the right is up in the Met in New York, so they're not that far away from each other. And in fact, just last year they loaned it to us, and we had them side by side for the first time since the 18th century. They have not been together. But both of them focus again on Sophia, that same sort of figure, right? Chubby, zaftig figure. surrounded by just luxury items everywhere. And instead of the trees and whatnot, we have the drapes and the jewels and the urns and whatnot on the interior, right? This pair of pictures was made for the mistress of Louis XV. You've heard that name before, Pompadour, right? Have you? A Pompadour is now what we call like a big Marge Simpson hairdo, right? Would be a Pompadour. That's because Madame de Pompadour wore one, but she was the principal mistress of the French king. And these were commissioned to decorate her palace in the vicinity of Paris, right? So they fit into that exact same theme we've been talking about, love in the garden, right? In this case, it's mythological love, right? Our last group of these pictures, Fragonard, one of the sort of the third of the great triumvirate of Rococo paintings, a pair of pictures at the National Gallery that were part of a suite of 4 that Fragonard made to decorate one of these aristocratic palaces near Paris. And again, they focus on love. So they're showing adults playing children's games as metaphors for courtship, as metaphors for love. So Blind Man's Bluff, right? It's like Marco Polo. You put a blindfold on and you try to find people by reaching out and grabbing them, right? And here's a close-up of that. And there we see it's a woman, and everybody's sort of staying away from her. But obviously this is a not too veiled metaphor, right, for the courtship ritual, right? You're blindly seeking someone. You're blindly reaching out, and who knows what you're going to get. You don't even know. And, love is blind, right? So definitely as a metaphor for sex, right? Or at least the build-up to it. Same thing is true for the swing. And again, you'll notice that she's first, the swing is being set in motion by these 2 figures, a man and a woman in the back, who are yanking on the ropes, right, to get her swinging higher. And she swings up, and her feet are out, and there are people down on the ground below looking up at her. And the idea of being set into motion and swinging through the air is another not very veiled metaphor for erotic abandon, right? When you fall in love, you feel as if you're sailing, right? You feel as if you're just being set into motion. And so the swing is for her a metaphor for that. The aristocrats doing nothing, but, right, idling around because they don't have to work. Dunking the dog in the water to clean him off, right? I wonder if he just took a poop somewhere that he wasn't supposed to or something like that. But again, couples everywhere enjoying themselves. And again, this frivolous time in the garden to celebrate. The most famous of these versions is in London. Fragonard did numerous versions of swings. There's an article out just talking about the swinging women in Fragonard's work. And this one really illustrates that what we were talking about with the National Gallery work, which is that she's again being set into motion by a man behind her who's pulling on the ropes. So you're looking back there. And others are looking up at her, but now it becomes a little bit more overt. The guy down below, who's the one who commissioned the picture, is hiding behind the bushes and hoping to get a little view up her skirt, right, as she goes swinging and hits the apex of it. And we get a little view as well, up to the knee, which is far more than you would get in society. He gets to see further up, right? It's a naughty little picture, isn't it? And we actually have the letter he wrote to Fragonard when he commissioned the piece. And by the way, look at this. So there's that, go walk in the park, right? You go to what's our park name? Rock Creek Park. Go walk in Rock Creek Park in the summer, and all of a sudden the bushes are just growing out at you everywhere and coming everywhere. And you see back here, it's like everywhere we look, it looks like clouds almost. The amount of leaves everywhere. Well, the guy down there with the powder wig, sitting right below Cupid, is going, right? Because this is naughty. And he wrote a letter to Fragonard to commission this piece, and he said, "What I want you to do is I want you to paint a picture of my beloved, my girlfriend, on a swing, and I want you to put me in the bushes, right? And I want the swing to be set in motion by a priest. Doesn't that sound like kinky now, right? I want a priest back there pulling on the ropes of her, and I want you to put me in the corner, and I want you to put me in the corner right where I can see upper dress, right? And so what's happening here, and this is, if you watch read his gesture, he's feigning surprise, right? See his hand is coming toward us like, oh, oops, right? When in fact it's all planned. And what's happening is that she swings back and swings forward, and her shoe comes off, right? Talk about abandon. Right? Her shoe comes off. Every time she comes forward, he pushes that bush back, right? He's hiding there. So she's down there, and she knows he's there. She's looking down there. But then when she comes up, he goes, ha ha, right? And then back comes the bush again. He's pushing it out so he has a better view. Right? And that's exactly what he said. Put me down where I can see her, right? And have a good view of the legs of my pretty little thing. So this incredibly frivolous style, right, of the Rococo, which is an utter reaction against Poussin, right, or Claude Lorrain, the more classical style of the 17th century. This is the Baroque, or you made the Rococo, right? And that's a great place to break because we're going to see the reaction against this as we move into the 19th century, right, in French art, as we move back to classicism in the next generation of artists. So that's where we'll pick up on Monday.